Hi everyone, welcome back to the What Is and What Isn't series. Today we're going to take on one that I actually struggled with quite a bit, and I'm not even so sure I got it right. You can let me know if I didn't. Is what is and what isn't codependency. Before I get to the video, I'm just going to give a reminder, because this might resonate more with this topic too, is those of you interested in doing a deeper dive on healing, deeper than we can do on YouTube, please look at the video notes. You'll see the link for my healing program, which is a subscription program designed to help people who want to do the much deeper dive onto healing, like I said, than we can do here on YouTube. You can get that information there. But let's go back to this idea of what is and what isn't codependency. As I said, this was a tough one to even sort of think about, and even as we were doing the pre-production on it. And I know many survivors of narcissistic abuse have been put into the sort of codependency label barrel. But it's a classification that doesn't always fit survivors of narcissistic abuse. And it can actually lead to more pathologizing or even self-pathologizing the person stuck in the narcissistic relationship and not giving them the kind of education they need about how these patterns play out in the relationship. Instead, the person will say, I'm just codependent, and not learn the things that they need to learn. Codependency is not a sort of an official diagnostic term or even sort of an official clinical term. It's a term that evolved in the addiction literature, and it refers to the idea of a person making an ongoing investment of their own self-esteem. So they invest their own self-esteem in the behavior and the emotional states of another person. I feel good if they feel good, kind of thing. This is done even when it's not good for the person to be doing that. And then they take responsibility for the other person's needs to the exclusion of their own needs. Folks who are called codependent often experience anxiety around closeness and anxiety around separation. So it can feel like an approach-avoidant dance. And a consistent pattern in people who are called codependent is that they are typically in relationships with people who have maladaptive personality styles. Yes, like narcissistic personalities, as well as people who might be substance users or other codependent people or people who are impulsive. And as a result, these are relationships that are often characterized by chaos, volatility, and a lot of start-stop. And no matter how bad it gets, no matter how many people weigh in, and even if the codependent person is losing significant relationships, for example, their own children, close friends, healthy family members, they will choose to remain in the codependent relationship. Codependent people may often eschew or turn away help, may not seek therapy, and may enable unhealthy patterns in the partner. For example, continuing to make drugs or alcohol available, sort of fostering the brokenness and keeping the relationship going with a primary fear that if the partner gets better, that they will leave. Now, with that description, I know that more than a few of you are thinking, yo, Dr. Ramani, that kind of sounds like a narcissistically abusive relationship. My best take on that is that it's quite possible that a subset of very severe narcissistic relationships, where no matter how many times narcissism and all the dynamics are described to the person, and there are no real discernible practical factors such as financial, cultural, caregiving that are in play, that some of this may fit. But it's not at all the majority of narcissistic abuse situations. There definitely can be overlap with codependent individuals often finding themselves stuck in compulsive and ruminative cycles like we may see in narcissistic abuse survivors, and a lot of reliance on denial. Oh God, it's not that bad. The relationship's not that bad. There's also overlap with folks who are codependent and folks experiencing narcissistic abuse. Both groups struggle with sadness, anxiety, being on edge, and the physical and psychological effects of chronic stress. So yeah, there is definitely overlap. So let's take a minute and talk about what codependency is not, because that may help a little with clarifying what is really quite a complicated issue. Number one, codependency is not a person who lacks knowledge of what is in front of them. Because codependency is so often based on a relationship with somebody who is using substances, it's clear to them the person in front of them is using. They can see the intoxication, they can see it, and the excuses are about something that's clear. And if it's about other impulsive and dysregulated styles, they see it because they're yelling or screaming or breaking things, and they aren't ready or amenable. The codependent person's not ready or amenable to hearing that this isn't healthy or sustainable. In other patterns, most pointedly narcissistic abuse, the person who's in the relationship often doesn't know they are in a narcissistic relationship. They just don't know it's a thing. They don't know that narcissism doesn't really change. They don't know that it's not their fault. They don't know what gaslighting is. In my experience, in the vast majority of narcissistic abuse survivors, until they read or heard about what it was, they just simply assumed that they were the problem, that these were just relationship problems, and there were just enough good days for say, this has got to be my problem. In a large proportion of people experiencing narcissistic abuse, once they finally see what it is, it's a wake-up call. Not all people leave, but they will. Most people will commit to doing some of what they need to make the situation a little healthier and more livable, and not believe it's not a problem. They know it's a problem. Practical factors may make leaving hard. Number two, codependency is not only just staying for practical reasons. This is a tricky one, because at some level, it can feel like someone is making a judgment about qualifies as sort of real or practical reasons for staying. And that's not black or white. But let's face it, given how family courts operate, some people stay in these relationships because they don't want to share custody. They don't want to be away from their kids. They don't want their kids to have solo time with a narcissistic co-parent. And they don't trust the court to make a reasoned decision. So they feel they can protect their children better by staying in it. Some people stay for very real financial reasons, especially if they might have signed restrictive prenuptial agreements or are part of a relationship where there simply aren't enough financial resources to support two households, or for reasons of disability or inability to work at a job that will pay at a level to support a subsistence life, basically to be able to pay the rent. These are people who would say, in a millisecond, if I had the money or I had some assurance that I'd have the ability to make decisions for my child, they would be out. Or they may plan to be out once their youngest child is of an age where the family court is no longer an issue. It's very easy to stand in judgment of someone who stays for financial reasons. But let me tell you this, if you've ever been so broke that you were on the verge of not having a safe place to live, you would understand it. Some people may argue it gets hazier when it gets to cultural or religious issues. I don't know if it's hazier. If a person will be stigmatized by their entire community, lose all of their support, or be rejected by the only things that they know, the only systems they know, that's a big ask. I have worked with clients in all of these situations. We work on radical acceptance, ending self-blame, but there ain't a day that goes by in which they see it clearly, grieve the injustice, hope for the day they may not be stuck in it, and do the best they can. But they are no longer issuing excuses for the toxic person's behavior, denying it, or hoping it will get better. A third thing that's not, if you will, codependency. Codependency isn't about staying in a relationship because of the enablers around them pressuring you to stay. In general, the people around the codependent individual are screaming, "Run! Get out of this!" Sadly, the terms enabler and codependent are often considered somewhat synonymous. For many people in narcissistically abusive relationships, enablers make leaving harder. In codependent relationships, the toxicity of the relationship is a little more readily apparent. You might see things like numerous scrapes with the law, chronic substance use, but the partner is still allowed back in. In other relationships, where the emotional abuse, which is still not recognized by so many people and is not often as manifest, it is often the enablers that keep it in place. Number 4 way that thing that is not, I should say, codependency. Codependency does not allow for radical acceptance or realistic expectations, whereas this is possible in other toxic relationships. For example, in people experiencing narcissistic abuse, this is not something we see in a codependent relationship. Once a person actually gets to radical acceptance, they would probably really no longer qualify under the codependent designation. Like, okay, this is it. It's never going to change. I get that. And then make their decisions accordingly. It's a really tough thing to say what is and what isn't codependency, especially when we're talking about narcissistic abuse. And I do think that the overlap zone between the two is not small. But the real smell test is what a person does once they get the information about what this relationship is. They may not leave, but they may also no longer excuse it. I do struggle with how much codependent people are blamed or dismissed for their situations. So much of this is about trauma bonding, and one could argue that codependent individuals have more extreme trauma bonded situations relative to what we observe in other toxic relationships, and exploring other issues like complex trauma become very, very important. Language matters. And for any survivor who is clear about the dynamics and the architecture of narcissistic relationships, whether they stay or go, it's often not codependency. It's often a practical stuckness. And for some folks, getting exposure and knowledge about the narcissistic abuse framework, how all of that works, can actually be what snaps them out of a codependent cycle and into a cycle of more active growth and self-awareness. It's a process, it takes some time, but knowledge, when it really illuminates the room, really argues against what is traditionally labeled codependency. Thanks again.